So we're taking it downstairs today because upstairs is it's like a sauna. I don't know why, but it traps all the heat up there. Well, I kind of know why. Heat rises. So upstairs gets all the heat and I cannot get it out because the air is like jello and nothing moves. But that's of no real concern to this video. I'm actually going to jump around a bit in the order of the writing of the book, because one slightly later chapter becomes actually kind of relevant with the previous talk about speculative fiction. And now I'm yawning again. I don't know why I yawn when I do these videos. I don't yawn otherwise. It's only when I do these videos, not even when I'm tired. That's weird. But yes, I've tried to find the title or any title or name or whatever for this genre, but I cannot really find anything concrete. The best I can find is the old genre, very, very old, 1,000 years old actually, genre called a morality play, which was a stage play back in the Middle Ages, probably also later, but that's where it originated from, where the main characters are struggling with a moral dilemma. One of those angels on one shoulder, devils on another kind of situation. And even though I cannot find any name for this in modern fiction, there is a very common genre, or at least a very common type of story within other genres, especially science fiction, that does something a bit like this. It essentially takes the speculative fiction concept of basing a world around a notion and twists it, turns it on its head. So instead of having a world based around a notion, you have some part of the world or some kind of experience, some situation that begins to pose a lot of questions that are hard or impossible to answer, and it becomes perhaps not a moral dilemma, not necessarily a moral dilemma anyway, but definitely a quandary for the main characters how to handle this situation. You could equate it in some way to horror, in that, as I mentioned, horror is based on not knowing what to do. And in this case, you also do not have a clear idea what to do, but there is not the same kind of threat. Not unless you make it an actual horror story, at least. You can combine them. But these, I need a name for it. Let's just call them modern morality plays or morality stories. Modern morality story. A modern morality story will pose some questions that make clear action harder. For example, there could be a situation where the main character has to decide whether to hurt someone in order to do something that they need to do. Maybe it's in the kind of crude versions, it's something selfish like advancing your career or getting money or something. And would you be willing to do it if you learned that it hurts someone? and you can get a lot of story out of that about this. This is pretty much a morality play through and through, actually, with the devil saying, take the money, and the angel saying, no, care about others. But it can also be more complex than that. For example, deciding who is more worthy of not being hurt by a situation. If you have to decide between one thing that really gets on my nerve, but it's a very common thing in stories, is the idea of the needs of the many. I think it was actually Star Trek that coined that phrase, or at least made it more known amongst the public. The need of the many, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. The idea that you may be faced with someone that you cannot help without hurting many more, many others. And that gets a lot of play in stories because you can put a lot of weight behind the idea that yes, this person, you have met them, you know their face, you know their story, you know their situation. But if you help them, if you even try to help them, you will hurt a lot of other people. And it is obvious from a very utilitarian, very cold and cynical standpoint that you choose the needs of the many over the needs of the few because you'd rather hurt a few than hurt many. But the personal connection is such good story fodder that the entire experience of having to make a decision like that can be a gruesome tale, a very psychological tale. But you can move it even beyond that. Something that has started cropping up over the last 10 to 20 years. It has been there before that, but it has really started coming into focus. And because of certain events in modern science, it will probably come more into focus, at least in stories in the near future, is the idea of artificial sentience. Not just artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is just a machine capable of reasoning, capable of learning. But artificial sentience is the idea that the machine is actually a person, is actually aware of itself and its surrounding, and perhaps is worthy of being treated as a person. But that is not in our nature. And even if the machine is harmless, which is definitely not always the case in these stories, but even if it is harmless, the question of whether you should respect the machine as a person can lead to a lot of conflict and a lot of drama because the machine is very likely to also be property. In fact, the artificial intelligence that may or may not be sentient is very likely to be someone's property. So this is, to some, this will be the question of should you care about the emotions of your car because it is a machine. The artificial sentience is a machine and cannot possibly be thought of as a person. But others will ask the question, is this a person? Can we actually treat them the way we are treating them? And this is getting a lot of less direct, story focus, but a lot of tangential story focus. One thing that comes to mind is the movie Free Guy, which incidentally I rewatched not so long ago. Coincidence, has nothing to do with anything else, but might be why it's popping up in my mind. Where in a very advanced game that takes place in a fictional city where, like Grand Theft Auto, people are just going wild and having missions like robbing banks or stealing cars or something like that, just having fun by wreaking havoc. But the game has an advanced AI, and one day that AI causes one of the characters in the game, one of the NPCs as they're called, non-player characters, the ones that no player, no human being is controlling him. This is a computer character entirely. But because of the artificial intelligence, it starts acting like a human being, starts having its own ideas, its own desires, its own experiences, and it finds out that the world it lives in is actually a game, and it starts playing that game in a very different way, causing a lot of chaos and a lot of attention from the people who make the game. And although a lot of it is played for laughs, it's a Ryan Reynolds movie. Although a lot with Taika Waititi also, so a lot of it is played for laughs. But even in spite of that, there is an undertone of, is this a person or is this just a computer program that is acting in unexpected ways? And the old morality play concept kind of starts to push itself into that, starts forcing you to ask questions about what is right and what is wrong, but also just what is what. There are a lot of very heavy questions that they don't have to be as heavy as in existential um, existential stories. I think it was existential sci-fi I focused on, although, as I said back then, the existential genre can be anything. It's not, it doesn't have to be that deep or worrying, but there are very few straight answers. And the point of this genre, of this modern morality play, is to ask the questions more than it is to find the answers. It's supposed to make you think about whether these things are as simple as you assume. And very often there will be consequences of either decision. Those consequences will be either hinted at or demonstrated in the story. Most of the story could easily be about the consequences of either decision if the questions has to have to be asked many times for many things. For example, if we stick with the artificial intelligence idea, if more than one artificial intelligence starts going sentient around the same time, and each of them is treated differently, either slightly differently or very differently, you will start to see the results of this. And in a way, that can be tracked to other genres that we don't really consider to be morality plays all that much. Something as well known and well established as the Ebenezer Scrooge story, A Christmas Carol, I think it's called. But the story of Ebenezer Scrooge, the one with the ghosts that keep revisiting him. the idea that you're seeing the consequences of your actions, different outcomes. This story has a very simple be a better person solution, but the concept of it can step in and become a greater dilemma of a morality play. For example, you could have a story that deals with how rich people handle poor people in any time of history and the consequences of that. They handle different poor people differently and they have different consequences with it. And the question could be how to handle that. Usually that's not as interesting, but the point is that it doesn't have to be a very big and complicated morality play in order to be a morality play or modern morality play. It just has to pose a question that is not easily answered and that has to be thought over, and thinking it over will have consequences for the story. Whether that is the consequences of what actions are taken or the consequences of people asking the questions. You could have people asking questions about some whatever topic. It could be environmental. Is this a good idea to change this city in a way that will make it better, but that it's hard for the environment? I know this sounds very dull, but it's just a summary. The story can be whatever it is. It can be very exciting if it's written right. Um, but you could have that be the question, but the real story unfolds with how people react to the questions being even asked. What kind of factions exist that want to answer it one way or the other? There are the environmentalists, there are the industrialists, there are the common citizens, and probably many different common citizens with many different ideas around what it is. And even without trying to get an answer to the question, just asking the question can start the snowball rolling, and you can build a story around that. And from there on, it can just branch out. You can have all these factions all having their own actions, and you start posing other questions that are equally valid. For example, in the environmental story, maybe environmentalists start getting fed up with people saying, "Oh no, you shouldn't think about the environment," and they start destroying the project, which in itself has its own consequences, and it escalates. It just branches out and snowballs from there, and you start getting a lot of facets on what might originally seem like a simple question. But when you start digging into it and you start actually having to look for answers and maybe even have to look for practical answers that can be implemented, things start to get complicated, especially if you start exploring the world around it as well. Start asking questions about how does the world react to anything involved in all of this. It can get chaotic, but in many ways, it's the kind of chaos that stories bloom from. So I wish I had a more definitive description of this, but as I said, it's not a genre that really gets a lot of attention. But I find it to be one of the more interesting things that modern storytelling has started looking into. So I'll cut it off just before the 20-minute mark, and that'll be that for now.